This week, our weed that we're going to focus on is Perilla Mint. It's an escaped ornamental, and so we have some of those in various parts of the state, other ornamentals that have escaped into our barn lots and to our pastures. So this is just another example of an escaped ornamental. It's a summer annual. It goes by other names throughout the U.S. where it might be found: beefsteak plant, purple mint, rattlesnake weed. But probably the most important thing to understand about this plant is it is toxic to livestock. Some of the key things to identify this plant is it is in the mint family. And so some of the family characteristics of mints are that they have opposite leaves. This particular plant has serrated or toothed leaf margins, as you can see in the pictures. It's green leaves, typically with a little bit of a purple splash of color, and you can kind of see some of that purple tinge on the underside of that leaf on that bottom picture. And then the other key to this family is the minty or aromatic odor of the plant, and that minty odor will increase with maturity. Another characteristic of mints is square stems. And so this seedling I pulled just the other day, and then just took a cross section of that seedling, and you can see that square stem and some of the hairs on that stem. So again, that's another characteristic of mints. This particular mint, the Perilla Mint, does prefer shaded areas. This picture I took a few years ago out of a pasture. And so again, it's concentrating along those fringes, along those edges where the shade is heaviest. And so that is a characteristic to help go to a location that's shaded to start as a starting point to try to identify this plant. As it matures, it'll reach a height of about 2 feet tall at maturity. And the flowering structures are basically a bottle brush flower cluster, typically at the apical part of the plant. Those flowers will have hairs. And the important thing about understanding this plant is that the toxicity level will definitely be highest at that flowering stage. So we want to definitely manage this plant before we really reach this point. When we talk about the toxicity, all the plant parts are toxic, but again, it's most toxic at flowering. It causes an acute respiratory distress syndrome. It does cause basically a panting disease, inflammation of the lungs. And so it's toxic both in fresh and dried hay. Its highest risk, though, is again at that fresh, at flowering. So again, that's the key, is that we want to avoid getting to what you see in that picture. So how do we scout, or how do we manage? Well, we need to scout like weed management, scout early. So we want to get out and look. May through June is the 2 ideal months, but we can start earlier in mid-May. For certain parts of our state. Management would include our 3 most common control methods, which are chemical, mechanical, and cultural practices. Our chemical control, really this weed gets a little tough after about 8 inches tall. So timing needs to be for chemical applications, those actively growing seedlings, as you see in the picture. Once we start getting taller, our effective active ingredients, 2,4-D dicamba-aminopyrrolide, picloram, which are common active ingredients in a lot of our pasture package mixes and standalones, they start to decrease as that plant gets bigger. So if we miss this timing or the plant gets a little big, the next step would be some mechanical management through mowing, trying to clip that plant, it being an annual, trying to get it clipped to reduce seed production. And then cultural practices basically is being able to identify this plant early so that you can get a timely application of a herbicide if you have a problem with this weed. And then also understanding that the highest toxicity level is during that flowering stage. So providing adequate late summer feed to our livestock to help avoid the temptation to munch on some of those flowering plants that might be along the edges. And then obviously it's still toxic potentially in the hay or dried plant. If you're cutting an area as a late season cutting, we want to definitely avoid those large patches around shade where the plant might be at higher density. So those are just some practices that you can just keep in mind as you're managing this weed. And as I always recommend it to any producer out there, is that we have an excellent weed science group at the University of Missouri. And so their website is right there, and a great pasture and hay production manual. IPM 1031 is their weed and brush control manual. It's a pictorial guide. Perilla Mint is in there. It's got excellent pictures of many weeds that you might run across in your pasture and hay fields.
Will cows normally avoid eating this if they have other forage available?
Correct. This plant is avoided, like many of our toxic plants. Cattle will stay away from it. The highest risk, like what they've reported in Tennessee and other states, is that if you have, let's say, a drought year or have some kind of issue where there's limited feed towards that flowering stage, that late summer, early fall time frame, if it's a limited supply of other options, they might clip some of those flowering plants, and that can be a risk. So yes, providing one of those practices of cultural practices is providing adequate feed, identifying, fencing off areas if you can't get to them.
What is the chemical compound responsible for toxicity?
The compound in the plant is called perilla ketone. And what happens with that particular compound is that it's ingested by the animal, and then actually in the lungs of the animal, it's metabolized to a compound which is very toxic to the lungs. It destroys certain types of cells that are in the alveoli of the lungs and stimulates the proliferation of other types of cells, which make breathing more difficult for cattle, make them more susceptible to respiratory diseases. And again, oftentimes we start seeing these plants growing and starting to flower in the late summer. And again, generally they'll avoid eating them, as Anthony said, unless there's not a lot of other forage. I have been in some situations where some animals seem to have a preference for them more than others. But the other things that I would say, and occasionally we have situations, I know Sarah has reported some in the past, where people have lost quite a number of animals simultaneously. I usually in those situations suspect that there are some complicating factors, such as, let's say, nitrate accumulation in some plants, or let's say possibly some problems with anaplasmosis, which may make animals anemic and makes them more predisposed to having some of these respiratory problems. And again, I always recommend, if there are losses of cattle, I usually recommend that they have a post-mortem exam by a veterinarian to see what the actual cause of death is.